I almost said good morning because it's not. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate you all for being here today. I thank you for taking the time to spend some time with us to find out exactly how curriculum can, in fact, be violent. So I will start by sharing my screen with you all. And let's go. All right. So I will start by saying, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat or drop them in the Q&A. I want to get through this information, and I also want to leave enough time so that we can ask questions. So without further ado, I thank you for unpacking curriculum violence, an exploration of identifying and understanding equity in curriculum. So before I begin, I want to let you know what the plan is for today. I want to define and unpack what curriculum violence looks like. I want to identify and understand the inherent inequities that further it. And then we want to end by taking curriculum violence itself to task and learning to mitigate its impact. So just a little bit about me. My background is in African American studies. I've been an English teacher. I've been an educational leader. My doctorate is in curriculum and social policy. I also do have a Six Sigma Yellow Belt in racial equity. I'm a member of the Cook County Digital Equity Committee. I am the author of several books, and I have been a disciplinarian for over 17 years. I am a student of all things equity, and that includes curriculum. So usually I would kind of take the time to put together a safe space and put those non-negotiables together. However, because we're limited on time, I just put together some community norms to help us feel safe. Because one of the things that I realize when we're talking about equity in curriculum is that it's a very vulnerable subject. And because of that, even in a webinar form, I always want to try and create some semblance of safety. So in that, I want us to be courteous and respectful and recognize that no one knows everything. We don't always have the bandwidth or the words to articulate what it is that we're trying to say. So let's give the benefit of the doubt and ask questions. Take care of yourself as you need to. It's only an hour, so this one isn't necessarily as ardent as it would be in a longer session. When you're speaking, use I statements, challenge assumptions, and be conscious of intent versus impact. Because sometimes, even when something is your intention, it doesn't always have the impact that you want it to have. But before we begin, I always begin with the things that I need for you to know when we are doing this equity work. There are going to be times where we don't get it right. There are going to be times where we fail. I recognize that failure is a four-letter word. It's a dirty word. But we also need to recognize that in those times that we don't get it right, there's still a lesson in that. And knowing that that is just putting you on one step further to getting it right. The biggie for me, equity is a journey, not a destination. This work will forever be changing, ever be evolving. There will always be times when you need to pivot. And for me, as somebody who's been doing this work for this long, the one thing that I notice is that as soon as I get one thing down, there's something else to go learn. In that, we also know that there are times where two truths can coexist. And you will have to simultaneously look inward while having to not make it all about you. And that equity involves everyone. It's everybody's responsibility. And that heavy lifting in changing these narratives is not necessarily going to be left solely to those marginalized groups. So, what today is not? Today is not a gotcha moment. Today is not an opportunity to put people on the spot to point out who or what's happening and who's doing something wrong. Today is not a space to try and make people feel guilty. But what today is an opportunity to learn and explore and unpack a new concept. Because I know that when I started doing the work around curriculum violence, there was not a lot out there about it. There were not a lot of people out there talking about it. And the only concrete definition of curriculum violence that I could find was the one that was written in 2010, but we'll unpack more on that later. What today is about is starting a deep dive into a subject or concept that you may only have surface knowledge of. And it's a chance to move away from your single story and examine curriculum through an anti-racist lens. So in the chat, and I think I'm going to stop my share so I can kind of see your answers. In the chat, when you first heard curriculum violence, what did you think it meant? What about the words curriculum violence made you want to show up today? Um, Violence included in our teaching instead of focusing on the positives. Okay. Disproportionate disparities, unintended harm to a group. These are all amazing answers. These are all very good answers. How curriculum may negatively be impacting our students, external influences on learn. Oh my goodness. All right. We all had a lot of thoughts about curriculum violence. This is amazing. I think that the words and practices and policies that harm learners. I just wrote a book called Lead with Two Rules, Feeling Good and Feeling Safe. I'm gonna have to grab that one. Someone said, I thought curriculum violence implied not supporting, oh, they're going so fast, supporting students in real world situations. Okay, so we've got a lot of ideas about what curriculum violence is. So with that being said, I want to move forward so that we can unpack the definition of what it is and get to how we mitigate it. So, as I said before, initially when I started my research, there was one definition that I could find, and that was from Ighodaro and Wiggins. And the way they defined curriculum violence was the deliberate manipulation of academic programming that compromises the psychological or intellectual well-being of learners. Now, a lot of us in the community kind of pushed back on that definition because it was the definition that we had at the time and it made sense. However, now that we've come over the last 10 or so years to understand that impact matters way more than we once thought it did, we are starting to see new definitions that don't just take it being deliberate into account. So over the years, we've come to know that intent matters very little when gauging the impact that curriculum violence has on learners. So one of the things that we're doing is amending the definition. And the way teach.com has done that is to change the definition to the subjective curricular choices around lesson planning or learning experiences that cause psychological harm intellectually and or emotionally. So in the new definition, the updated, I won't say new, the updated definition of curriculum violence, we've removed intent from the equation because the intent doesn't always matter when we're talking about its impact on children. Now, how does it impact students? One of the things that we realize when we start looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and imparting this concept of Maslow before Bloom is that our goal on the Maslow scale is to get students to self-actualization. And once they've made it to self-actualization, then we can start to get into those higher order thinking skills. But one of the things that we're now realizing with curriculum violence is that sometimes the curriculum compromises people's safety, their belongingness, and their esteem needs. So in terms of these things, the curriculum that we're imparting is not doing a very good job of getting us to where our students can be self-actualized. So what are some of the contributing factors to curriculum violence? And this list is on teach.com. So they have their definition and their list. You can find it on teach.com in their section about curriculum violence. one of the ways that they list as one of the things that they list as a contributing factor is the delivery format of activities. I don't know how many people remember. I want to say it was maybe 10 years ago now, maybe a little longer. There was a teacher, a social studies, third grade social studies teacher that went viral for putting a desk in the middle of her classroom. And I want to say it was like a 3x3 desk, and shoving the Black students underneath the desk and putting like 4 or 5 of them underneath the desk. And this was her way of demonstrating the amount of space that would have been available to you on the middle passage. Or we've had classes that have taken field trips to literal cotton fields and made students pick cotton and saying, this is what it would have been like to be a sharecropper. So these are all things that have been done in the past. And then you have content choices. Sometimes the content choices that we're choosing in the classroom can also be violent. One of the examples that they use is that for Jewish history lessons, only talking about the Holocaust. Not only is it not the single story of the Jewish community, but it can also be emotionally triggering to some people. Unbalanced perspectives. A lot of things within our history are taught from a very Eurocentric perspective. And because of that, marginalized groups are often either left out of the retelling of history or put into a very small box within that retelling. So one of the things that we look to do when we are trying to mitigate curriculum violence is to deliver a more balanced perspective. Inadequate time on topics. So I remember, goodness, 30 years ago, one thing my mom said to me when it had to be longer than that now, but she said something to the effect of, if I left it up to your book to tell me my history, the only thing I wouldn't think I ever did was pick cotton, invent the peanut, and be a slave. So just in terms of spending adequate time on topics and focusing on the numerous historical contributions of marginalized groups rather than fixating them into one curriculum. So in chapter 3, we're going to talk about all of the marginalized groups and their contributions. You have to spend adequate time with those things. Or there's the complete erasure of groups where you're not focusing on the identity of historic scholars or acknowledging one of the things teach.com talks about is the acknowledgement of queer identities and the erasure of certain entire whole communities or things like that. And then finally, the thing they talk about is in classroom behavior. One of the things that I used to always experience, which I didn't realize then, was that if we had to do something in class that was domestic in nature, it was, oh, let one of the girls pass out the milk. Oh, let one of the girls do this if it was involving food. If it wasn't involving food, then it was one of the boys that did it. And some of these things can be completely esoteric, but they're leaving a mark on the student that we don't even realize. Another way, when you are talking about teaching tolerance, one of the things that teaching tolerance tells us about how these things impact, especially in the last 3 years, indicates that our failure to educate students on certain subjects, there's also a lapse in their understanding of racial inequality, past and present. So basically, when you are not holding space and having these conversations, as with anything else, we're leaving it up to the students to fill in the blanks. And they're not necessarily filling in the blanks, with adequate information because they don't have it. So in addition to these things just being mistaught in our attempts to gloss over them or make them a single story or hurry up and move on to the next thing, the other piece of it is that we're not only slow in our teaching, but we're allowing for misinformation to creep in, and we're not rectifying it because we're not talking about it. So, all right. Um, a lot of my examples, and I was talking to Arlen about this earlier, a lot of my examples are from my own children's educational journey. And especially the next one I'm about to show you. It is an excerpt from my older daughter's AP Advanced Placement US History book. And I have this section because I got a livid text from my child in which she said, "Mom, look at this. You will never believe what's in my book." And this is what was in her book. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'll read the second paragraph to you. The head of the plantation had to care for his inferiors, much like a kindly father. This meant providing the necessities of life to slaves and white overseers and expecting faithful obedience, loyalty, and hard work in return. The plantation wife was an essential part of this culture, placed on a pedestal and expected to uphold genteel values of sexual purity, spiritual piety, and submissive patience. She managed the household. So I will stop here. I'll let you take a minute with that. And then I'll stop so I can take a look at these responses because I want to give you the opportunity to unpack, because there's several violent statements here. They're violent from a racial lens. They're violent through a gender lens. They're violent. There's violent through several lenses. So let's unpack this. So, the connotation and the use, someone is struck by the use of the word kindly. Inferiors and, yep, everybody keeps hitting that same inferiors. Inferiors and kindly fathers, and the fact that the woman is supposed to be, what did it say? Spiritually pure and submissive. The woman is submissive, and we are giving the workers, because they don't say slaves, the inferiors, the workers, we're making sure that they have everything they need. Now, last time, and I have a degree in African American studies. Last time I checked, I promise you the slaves didn't have everything they needed. I promise you they didn't. So this is the AP US history book. It's definitely a whitewashed experience. And but this is where the problem comes in, because we know that that is not the answer. But this is the AP US history book. So those of us that know how AP works, what happens if you don't give that answer? I have a couple questions. Is this the current AP US history book? My daughter graduated in 2018. So if it is not the current one, it wasn't that long ago, because that was what, 4 years ago? She graduated from high school in 2018. And when we took it to the administration, the response from the administration was two things. The response was two things, and I don't want to say too much because I'm not trying to cause a ruckus here. But the first thing that was said was, we have been told that we need to save money, and purchasing new textbooks is not in the budget. That was the first thing. The second response was, I'm Black and I don't have a problem with it. So I don't understand why the students are upset. So that was kind of the response that, excuse me, that the students got when they were kind of pushing back on this language. And the problem with pushing back on the language is, even if they pushed back on the language, and I did speak to the teacher myself, and the teacher acknowledged that this was not the dominant thinking, and he acknowledged that he recognized that it was inaccurate. He also said that he was holding space in his classroom to have those conversations. He did acknowledge that, and that he was allowing the students the space to say, this is not okay, this is not accurate. But again, in April, in May, when we take that test, we can't put the truth on the test if we want a 5. We've got to regurgitate the information that was given to them in order to get the grade that you got there to get. I'm loving these comments. Someone said being unaware of and ignorant of oppression doesn't mean that you aren't being oppressed. Amen. And then students feel like they need to comply because of the power dynamics. And are students really free to push back on the narrative? And that's when you get into this whole notion of free with an asterisk, right? Is free really free? What does freedom look like when I control your grade? And when you're in high school and you're in an AP class, what does freedom look like when I'm literally holding your future in my hand? So these are the ways. So for all of us that came here today looking for the answer of how can curriculum be violent, this is one of the ways that curriculum can be violent. Because even though we know the truth, there is the truth that we know, and then there's the truth that we have to tell to get out of our situation. So moving on, because I just realized that we are going to run out of time here, and I don't want that. So, this is another assignment from one of my children. And I know that I took a picture of the sheet. I know that you all can't see that, so I'll read the questions to you. Now, this seems perfectly innocent, right? Where do I come from? You can find this sheet in just about any icebreaker, any book, any worksheet that you could think of. Where did I come from? It seems super duper innocent, right? The questions are, what country does your family come from? When did your family move to the United States? Who in your family moved to the United States first is what it's supposed to say, I think. Who in your family moved to the United States first? How did your family come to the United States? Why did your family come to the United States? For a lot of people, this will be a really awesome time to kind of get some more information from the family tree. Super duper innocent. Let's sit down. Let's go have a conversation with grandma, great grandma, and talk about how our family immigrated to the United States. Well, for some of us, that's not always the case. Now, I did want to have a chat conversation here, but since it's 3:25, I'm going to move along and just show you what one of my children wrote. Because sometimes you don't get what you asked for. So how did I get here? Instead of writing an essay, she drew a panel. And I don't know how much of this you can see, so I will do my best to narrate it for you. It's a stick figure of what appears to be Africans, and it says, my ancestors minding their own business. And then it says, white people being nosy and colonizing. And then it says, we killed all the, I should have just brought the dog on paper. I don't know why I'm reading it off here. And then we killed them all. And then the thwack, thwack, thwack. And then she put the West Africans in the little bin and said, let's go to the plantation. And then it says, I'm better than you. I'm white. And then she goes on to say, 1865 to 1965, and it says whites only, and then it says the 70s, Soul Train, and then it says 2016, Skittles, failure to take off hoodie, and then there you have it. So I want to stop there, and we can unpack that a little bit. So, And then Julie says, this can be traumatizing. Not all students know their stories. That is true. And it doesn't always have to be from a racial perspective. I did some consulting work some years ago in a school district where I believe the children in care rate was something like 20% for the entire school. So 20% of the students were not living with either natural parent. And so, but we had this one old school teacher who insisted on, somebody just said foster children, who insisted every year on doing this big family tree assignment. And she, no matter how much administration talked to her, no matter how much people talked to her about offering alternative assignments, this is the biggest assignment of the year. And she would always go down the list of all of the skills that these students would be learning while they were doing this family tree assignment. And they would engage their research skills because they got to interview their relatives. And then they got to learn how to aggregate the research when they got to put it together. And when I tell you she had it down, like she had this whole spiel about everything that was happening and why there was no other assignment but this family tree assignment where these students could get these skills. And no matter how much the social worker talked to her and said, okay, I get it, you love this assignment, but can you offer it in a list of other alternative assignments? Because maybe, just maybe, there are other people that don't want to do this assignment either. So these are the ways in which the violence in curriculum shows up. And a lot of times it's racial violence, but not all the time. It's all the time it's not racial violence. It can be violent in many ways. It's violent when, like I said, we are talking about these immigration stories and people don't know how they immigrated here. Yes, I did say daughter. That was an assumption. I did. I only have daughters. So yes, it can be violent in a number of ways. And we don't talk enough about it. And that's why curriculum violence is one of my passions. And I want to get to the next part of this because I want to leave the last 10 to 15 minutes so that we can get some questions answered. So yeah, but there was a question in the chat about my daughter's answer. They weren't really sure what to do with her, just like they already know that I'm going to stand behind my child when she's right. And her assignment answered your questions. And it's not her fault that you gave out an assignment that only acknowledged a single story. So this is how it can look in college. And I fully recognize as an English major, as an English teacher, that we often tell our students the hallmark of a great writer and the hallmark of a great debater is that you should be able to persuade anybody of anything, whether you agree with it or not. I fully recognize that. But I also think that we need to deal with that within reason when we're talking about human beings. So when we give students assignments like, imagine that you're James Henry Hammond, newly recipient of a letter from that notorious abolitionist and fugitive slave Frederick Douglass. You promptly draft a reply to this bold fellow, one that will offer such a persuasive and well-reasoned defense of slavery that it will shame all abolitionists into silence. That was just one question. The other question was, imagine that you are Frederick Douglass, author of the recently published narrative recounting your experiences in slavery. Lately, you've read that pro-slavery treatise that has everyone in anti-slavery circles outraged, James Henry Hammond's Letter to an English Abolitionist. You decide to engage Hammond's arguments in a letter to the man himself, bringing to your response the same brilliant strategy that shaped your narrative. Now, again, as an English teacher, I understand what we are trying to do, but I think what is lost on the author of this is that this is not just a narrative. You're asking a person to define their right to exist, and that's different. So, I guess now we can go to the chat. Do these two questions qualify to you as curriculum violence? And it's okay if they don't. Is there a way for these two questions to be written so that you can still get this same point across? Is there a way to make these questions less violent? And I guess that's my question. Do you feel that these are violent? I do, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you do. And if you don't, let's talk about it. And if they are violent, is there a way to have this argument and make it less violent? Someone said, in systemic racism power structures, there are no two sides to every story. There's the truth and the view from the power structure. They could also focus on equity or justice or laws or people instead of the slavery, no slavery construct. But the way I'm starting to see things, I almost said 2023, in 2024, is that for some reason, we've gotten into this binary structure. And it's either you agree with me or you hate me. And I'm not sure how or why we got there, but that's where we are. So we're not leaving a lot of time for real conversation. We're not leaving a lot of time for true intellectual exchanges. And then someone said, I wonder where there is a way to talk about Douglas debates without inherent violence because the discussion is violent. That's a good question, because one thing that I've noticed, and if there are any history teachers in the room, please correct me, because I haven't taught history in about 20 years, but I know that when I first started, we would spend a lot of time on the Stephen Douglas debates. And those were kind of everywhere all the time. It's like you couldn't get through a year without talking about the Lincoln Douglas debates and Stephen Douglas versus Abraham Lincoln. And we kind of moved away from that for a while. Are we back to that, or are we still not talking about them? Because I think that part of the reason that we moved away from the Lincoln Douglas debates was for this same reason, is that there were people that would have to argue why owning a human was good and okay. Someone said, I teach angle of vision and perspectives in college English and have spears hanging in many of my rooms to demonstrate that our arguments can be in any areas of domain instead of a linear argument. We love a linear argument in 2024. I blame social media. So let's move on here. So one of the ways that I've come up with when we're looking at curriculum, and this is a really quick check for yourself in a way that you can take curriculum to task. So one of the things, what we're doing when we're taking curriculum to task is we're thoroughly examining the lesson at hand. So we're taking a look at it, we're actually reading it, as opposed to this is what's in the textbook, just read pages 5 through 10. You've actually read pages 5 through 10, and you're asking the questions of the lesson. Do these questions undermine the narrative of a single story? Do they undermine that narrative? is this, like someone just said, is this being done from a linear perspective? Or are we looking at all the angles of vision? Because it can't be, is this binary? Is this through just that one singular lens? And if it is, how do we fix that? The other piece of this that we need to do when we take it to task is to seek honest, inclusive alternatives. So if we've assessed this and we find that it is a part of the single story, that it doesn't undermine the narrative of a single story, that it propels that notion of a single story, is there something out there that is more inclusive? One of the examples that gets used a lot in the curriculum violence community, because it's one of those right there things, is the story of Thanksgiving. When we talk about Thanksgiving, are we having our students come in and sit down and talk about this notion of having the Pilgrims and the Indians, and we're so tired and we're going to die, and the Native Americans showing up and saying, let us save you, and now we do this every year? That is a very single story, a very binary story that we now, thanks to historians, know is not true. So when we're teaching this lesson, are we seeking out honest, inclusive alternatives? And once we do that, we have to keep reevaluating and adjusting as necessary. One of the things about taking curriculum violence to task that we always must be mindful of is that when we know better, we do better. And one of the problems that we're having right now, societally, is that we know better, but doing better doesn't make us collectively feel good. So we just choose not to do it. It's like, yeah, we know Christopher Columbus didn't discover America, but I like having that day off, and it's offensive for us to go back and correct our mistakes. So how dare you try to take Columbus Day away from us? How dare you try to change it to Indigenous Peoples Day? So the problem comes in, and where a lot of us are getting stuck is that I won't even say we're knowing better, we're learning better. But in the learning better, we're not translating that to knowing better and doing better. And because we're missing that step, it's not allowing us to do our K, which is keep reevaluating and adjusting as necessary. And this is kind of what you do on a classroom level as an educator, giving the assignment in your classroom. This is you taking your assignment to task. So, of course, not all decisions are made on that level. So one of the things that we want to talk about is how the powers that be can have an impact. And what are we doing when we're having an impact, when we're not necessarily choosing classroom assignments, but more larger curriculum things? So we're investigating the importance of reviewing and reflecting upon curriculum within the context of current knowledge and climate. So what does that look like? Like somebody said before, we're examining things from all angles. When we are and we're doing this at all grade levels. So one of the things that we're learning is that for the smaller kids, one of the things that I remember learning is, if you're in trouble, you go find Officer Friendly. Officer Friendly is here to help you. Well, if we're looking at that within the context of current knowledge and climate, for some communities, they don't associate Officer Friendly necessarily with help. So in teaching those lessons, we need to take that into account and adjust accordingly and figure out how to get those messages across within the current context, knowledge, and climate. Now, maintain consistency across subject matter when implementing curriculum violence mitigations. So what does that mean? That means these things are usually done more readily and more easily in English and social studies classes, because that's where the humanities things occur, right? That's where we talk about the current events. That's where we talk about those things, or so that's kind of how things have been done. But one of the things that we need to understand now is that curriculum can be violent across the board. And we need to remember that and keep that up front and evaluate all curriculum for that very reason. Because one of the things I want to say 20 years ago now that we started to get in trouble with in the math world was some of these word problems in their attempt to be culturally competent or culturally relevant or whatever the language was of that time were just downright offensive. So next, prioritize curriculum that does not embrace the notion of a single story, but instead operates in the spirit of inclusivity and intersectionality. So in the comments, we've seen people talking about, well, I'm an immigrant, so my story looks different. I was a child who grew up in foster care, so my story looks different. And all of those are things that we need to incorporate as much as possible, because we're not going to get it all right all the time. That's just not how life works. And that's why I always start off at the beginning saying we're going to fail and we're going to fail again, because we've got to figure it out. And that's a part of figuring it out. So we're looking for those lessons or those curriculum that foster inclusivity and intersectionality. And we got to make sure that we're authenticating sources and acting accordingly. Once we know something to be inaccurate and untrue, do not continue to disseminate that idea. That goes back to that story of the discovering of America. Well, we've put so much into this narrative that we can't change it now. Why not? We absolutely can and should, because when you know better, you do better. Create spaces for students that you service to honor themselves, their background, and their history within the curriculum that is presented to them. Those spaces need to be there for them. We also need to tell well-rounded stories as they would relate to people of color. Trauma, pain, and death cannot be your sole focal point when talking about the lives of contributions of Black and Brown people within curriculum spaces. We talk all the time about slavery when it comes to African American people. If you turn on your TV right now, because Black History Month is coming, I bet you by golly wow, at least one station will be airing Roots. And when you change the station, the other one will be airing 12 Years a Slave. And when you change the station, the other one will be airing Emancipation. Why? Because that trauma and pain is the narrative of African Americans that society has chosen to put forth for public consumption. There are so many other stories to tell, but yet that is the one that has been decided is going to be told and told and told again. Now, I know that I have to stop for questions, but I do want to go back and share this one thing with you that I found in one of the teacher groups. And it looks to, sorry about that. It looks to be a response journal that a teacher put out. And I don't know how well you can read this handwriting, so I'll read it out loud. It says, "Today was not a good learning day. Blah, blah. I only wanted to hear you not talking. You said something wrong, and I can't listen when I hear lies. My mom said that the only Christopher we acknowledge is Wallace, as in Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, the rapper, because Columbus did not find our country. The Indians did. I like to have Columbus Day off. I want you to not teach me lies. That is all. My question for the day is, how can white people teach Black history? Signed, King." The teacher response was, "King, I'm very disappointed in your journal today." And King's response was, "Okay." So I'm going to get to my contact information so that you'll have that. And then I will pull this down and we can spend the last part with the Q&A. And if anybody wants to respond to King's journal entry. So we've got 13 minutes for questions. I thank you for coming to learn about curriculum violence. These are the ways that you can reach me. I'm at Strong Conversations on Facebook and Instagram now. I am at Dr. Carolyn Strong on Twitter. Here is my phone number, and there is my email address. And if you have questions, I am ready to answer them, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Really appreciate it. Like you said, we've got plenty of time for Q&A, so type your questions or your responses to King's Journal entry into the chat, and Carolyn will be here to address them.
I definitely will. I think do we have a couple? Because I see some in the chat and then I see some in the Q&A. So I'm trying to figure out where we go first.
Yeah, it looks like the Q&A were people responding to what they thought curriculum violence was, and now I think most people are typing into chat, but I'll monitor Q&A as well.
Now, I have a personal question here. Miss Hutcherson, were you one of my daughter's teachers? I feel like I recognize that name. Okay, let's see what we got here. I do want to address this. I can't figure out why King's journal entry was disappointing. It's his journal and should not be. Oh, wait, it went away. I can't figure out why King's journal was disappointing. It's his journal and should not be subject to the teacher's opinion. Well, you know how that goes. Anytime anybody says anything that rocks the boat, it's a problem and it's disappointing. And why is it disappointing? It's disappointing because that's not what I taught you. It goes back to my daughter's AP history book, right? So if she were to tell the truth, she would fail. Not because she wasn't engaging in critical thinking, not because she wasn't correct in her assessment, but because she did not give the information back to them in the way that it was presented and in the way that they wanted it packaged back. The problem that we run into sometimes is that we say we want to create critical thinkers, and then when we do, we're not exactly sure what to do with them. And I found that out. I'll post my contact info again. I'll drop it in the chat. One of the things that I found out is that when this is the running joke in my house, everybody wants a Montessori kid until you get a Montessori kid. And because of the way Montessori teaches you to think outside of the box and think critically and do all of these things. And when you tell a kid to do something and then they kind of flip it on you and Montessori you, it's like, dang, I just got Montessori. Like, I'll tell my younger daughter to do something and she'll be like, well, what about this way? You told me to do it this way, but what about this and what about that? And you're like, dang, I really just wanted you to do it now. I got to have a conversation about it because this is what I've trained you to do. And this is what the school has trained you to do. But you have to do it. And the schools don't the teacher, especially King's teacher, doesn't really want to do that. She wanted him to write in his journal about what an awesome lesson she did because she clearly thought the lesson was awesome. I just spent all this time making this awesome lesson on Christopher Columbus and how he discovered this country. And the only thing that you have to say about it is that he didn't discover it. I'm not okay with you right now, King. Oh, somebody said education is something we do with children, not to them. Couldn't agree more. Did I miss any questions? How can school equity teams look to audit school curriculums? Oh, that is an excellent question. One of the things that I talk about in my journey toward anti-racism, which is on it's still on the ELN platform, Arlen, right?
Yeah, it's an on-demand administrator academy that IPA offers through Ed Leaders Network, and you can get your administrator academy credit. It's called Journey to Anti-Racist Education.
And one of the things in that one is a curriculum audit. It ends with an audit of your curriculum, of your milieu, of your community at large, and you have the tool of how you go about looking for the things in your curriculum that you may need to shore up from an anti-racist lens. And then it also provides you with an implementation plan. So once you go about your audit, then you say, and okay, here's a timeline. This is how we can fix this. This is how we now go about doing better. Because remember, once you know better, you do better. And that's the part that a lot of us don't get right. That's the part a lot of us don't get right. Okay, you dropped the link to the Admin Academy in the chat. And do I offer a longer session? Yes. Curriculum violence is typically a half day, because what I want you to do is bring in samples so that you can take those samples to task and see where you are falling on that continuum, where your curriculum is falling on that task curriculum. So I will put my contact info up again if that's a conversation that you want to have, because yes, going through curriculum violence in an hour is just not enough. Okay. Do we see more questions here? Did I miss any, Arlen?
Anita did ask, did you ask me a question about teaching your daughter?
Yeah,
Anita,
I
how'd you
did.
say?
I said her name sounded familiar, and I was like, "Where are you, Eden's teacher?" Because her name just sounded familiar to me. Um, that was it.
Okay. And then did you want to
Completely.
put up, did you, oh,
Yes, I will put
did
up
you
my contact information again.
if you want to put that slide up, I'll monitor
Yep.
that for you. Let's
Oh
see.
wait, oh no, that's the same audit school curriculums.
Yeah.
Okay, let me put it up now.
And then Anita said at Lincoln and Calumet.
Yep, I thought so. So you already know what I'm dealing with over here.
Katie asked a great question too. Will the contact information be emailed? Yes, I will include Carolyn's
As
email
soon as
address
I
and
can remember how
website.
to share my screen again, you all will have my contact info again.
And like I said, I'll send it out via email tomorrow with the recording link.
There we go. Email strongconversations@gmail.com is the fastest. Email or call is probably the fastest, because I always have my phone. I'm pretty quick if you message me on the Strong Conversations Facebook as well. It'll either be me or a member of my team, but email, it'll definitely be me. Phone, it'll definitely be me. Facebook, it may be me or a member of the Strong Conversations team. So are we, everybody, you said you were putting it in the chat too?
Yeah, I was keeping an eye on chat while you had your screen
And not
up.
the chat, I'm sorry, the email.
Tomorrow when I'll put you in the when I send the email, I'll put that information in it as well.
Okay.
That way people can get a hold of you that way. And again, we want to thank everybody for your attendance and participation this afternoon. I'll be sending out an email tomorrow once I get the video recording downloaded and available for you to stream. I'll be sending it out to everybody who registered as well as those who attended, along with an evaluation link. We definitely encourage you to give us feedback on the evaluation link. And our Illinois participants can get 1 professional development clock hour for their attendance today as well.
Arlen, do they get the slides? Because I see that question coming up a lot.
Oh, I don't normally send the slides, but if you want me to send them as maybe as a PDF, I could do that.
I will turn it into a PDF. I never have a problem doing that, because that's how we have to get the conversation moving and get the
Right.
conversations going. So I will turn them into a PDF and I will send them to you.
Okay. I'll package all that up in an email tomorrow. Be on the lookout for that. It'll be coming directly from Arlen at ilprinciples.org.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate you so much.
And we appreciate you as well, Carolyn. You've done a lot of great work for us and just really appreciate you having these strong conversations
Thank
in a
you.
safe space. This has been great. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.